Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. During the past few decades, the public and politicians were adopting one tough-on-crime proposal after another. In 1993, Washington State's voters passed an initiative that made Washington the first state to enact a 3 strikes and you're out law. 3 qualifying felony convictions would result in a lifetime in prison. More than 20 other states have copied Washington. The foolishness of this law is now becoming apparent. Many people have outgrown their criminal pasts, turned their lives around, and yet linger in prison, costing the taxpayers money when these people could be free and contributing to society. The 3 strikes law actually sentences taxpayers to a lifetime of wasting money imprisoning people who are no longer a threat to society. Also, as these prisoners age, they will develop more health problems, and their medical costs will impose additional burdens on taxpayers. Although the initiative's supporters claimed that it would protect us from the worst of the worst, actually the 3 strikes law is too broad, and it sweeps up many people whose crimes were not really very dangerous to society. And now a variety of organizations and individuals are working to reform or abolish the 3 strikes law. This month's TV program will focus on this topic. We have 3 guests who will share their knowledge and their insights with us, and I'm happy to welcome Moira Hennings, Vance Bartley, Noemi Maxwell. Moira Hennings' husband is in prison serving a 3 strikes life sentence. She also volunteers for the Department of Corrections Family Advisory Council. Good to have you here, Moira.
Thank you.
Vance Bartley was sentenced to life in prison for 3 strike offenses, but in prison he studied law and discovered a serious defect in the sentencing of his case and the conviction, and after 12 years in prison got his sentence overturned. Vance's knowledge of the law earned him a job as a paralegal in a Seattle law firm. Good to have you here, Vance.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be here.
Thanks. And Noemi Maxwell is a hardworking volunteer on 3 strikes and other criminal justice issues. She volunteers with Justice Works, a Seattle-based organization that works to end racism in the criminal justice system. Noemi, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's going to be an interesting hour because there's a lot of information and you have such interesting things to share from your own backgrounds and your insights that you've been developing over the years. Noemi, I wonder if you could just summarize what some of the main parts of the three strikes law, what that's about.
Well, as you said, this was a ballot initiative, and it was presented to the voters in 1993, passed in 1993. The idea behind the law, or at least what was advertised to people, is commit 3 most serious offenses and you are out. Basically, some people call it 3 strikes, you're in. You're, for the rest of your life, you're in prison. It's actually a sentence of 777 years, 77 months, 77 days, no possibility of release. And the crimes that are defined as most serious range from aggravated murder 1, which is the most serious crime in Washington State, at least as defined by the criminal code, down to crimes that are in the lowest quarter of criminal seriousness under state law, of crimes that result in no injuries, crimes that involve no weapons, and the lower seriousness crimes are actually the most common.
Mm-hmm. Vance, I wonder if you could summarize some of the main problems that people have been discovering with this law over the years.
Yeah, certainly. I think that one of the major discrepancies it revolves around the disproportionality, and the Sentencing Guideline Commission has spoken and said that in particular, robbery 2 and some forms of assault 2. Those crimes are not commensurate with other strike status crimes, and actually it was recommended that robbery 2 be removed altogether.
And that's like second-degree robbery is what people are used to that term, but
it's a non-armed, non-injury offense.
Yeah. Moira, your husband has first-hand experience with this law, and as a result, so do you. Can you tell us something about your husband's experience and what got him into the situation he's in, and what's happening with him now?
Well, he was a drug addict as a teenager and was never able to come out of it. He was sentenced to prison when he was 19 for a robbery 1. He came out still a drug addict and committed another robbery 1, both of which he pled guilty to. His third strike was a robbery 2, which was actually a drug deal, but it came out as a robbery 2, and not knowing that he was going to get 3 strikes, he asked for a trial, and they decided that it was a strike. Mm-hmm. So.
And he wasn't hurting anybody on that.
He's never hurt anyone.
Yeah. So, but it was, and so he was robbing to serve the habit.
Support his crime. Yeah.
Yeah, the habit.
Yeah.
And he's been in for 15 years?
This time 15 years, yes.
How have you and your husband kept the family together? What's been going on? You have kids?
We do. We have a 30-year-old.
And so how does the family get affected by this?
Well, Jenny was, raised without a dad. He did his best from prison. He's a very good parent, and he's parenting our grandsons as well now, because he's with so many youngsters inside. He sees what our kids are coming up against. So he works on that, but he's always been there. Mm-hmm.
And you said, when we talked on the phone to prepare for the program, you said that he's actually doing well in prison, relatively speaking.
Oh, he's doing wonderfully,
he participates in Narcotics Anonymous,
He goes to Narcotics Anonymous every week. He loves it. He's just starting to open up, so that's been really good for him. He participates in a youth group where they bring the kids in that are at risk, and he does that, I believe, twice a month. And he works, he's getting more involved in the Black Prisoners Caucus so that he can see what's going on.
And you visit frequently.
Every week.
You phone him?
He calls me every night, and we write each other every day, and I see him once a week at least.
Well, on the phone when we were preparing for the program, you said, we're just a big happy family, we just have separate addresses.
True story.
I thought that was a sweet way of seeing things.
Yeah, he's wonderful, and we have a happy family.
Yeah, but it's difficult in that setting, and for all the talk that politicians glibly make about family values, you folks are really practicing it from what it seems.
Well, we have a wonderful relationship. We're friends, and even if we couldn't be married, we'd still be friends. So it works out really well. We just are able to do what we need to do and keep it all together.
Yeah. Is there any hope that that things may work out, that is there anything legally going on that might be a
We've
a remedy?
been tossing things around. We've always been hopeful on the removing the robbery too from the strike list. We've become hopeful with the clemency options, but we're really hoping that the state will see fit to re-sentence people that have 3 strikes and look at their crimes, look at what they've done with their lives, and match it up and make something right for them. So there's always hope.
Yeah, you said he's 55.
He's going to be 55
and he's turned
next
his
month.
life around.
Yes.
So
yes.
he's not a threat to anybody.
No, he's clean. He's no longer a drug addict, and he did that on his own. He didn't have any help from DOC, which is what they should have.
Department of Corrections.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Which they should have done.
Yeah.
But
So it would seem to make a lot more sense if you could be home, rejoin the family, get a job, be a typical productive citizen, and
certainly, and,
you can be a
there's
family
things,
with the same address.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. There's so many things that he could do. He's well read and he's intelligent and he's educated, so that there is a spot for him somewhere out here.
Now, you had actually voted for the 3 strikes law back in '93, and this is ironic.
I did.
I'm sure the irony is not lost on
No.
anybody who knows you.
No, I did. I'm a rape victim, so I wanted those people to be locked up, and we were told it was the worst of the worst. So I signed up, and here I sit.
Let's see. Well, we've covered a lot of stuff on that page, but it's interesting how things, based on the actual experience, how things will look differently.
Yeah, it looks a lot different on this side.
Yeah, good. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Vance, you have an interesting life history. Tell us something about your childhood and the experiences you had that led you to prison.
I grew up in an abusive home. I was an African-American kid in a predominantly white community, so I was already struggling with, just identity issues. And I was in a single-parent home. We were in a poor social class. I didn't have role models. I didn't have a father. And I found my way to the streets, just like many other inner city kids. And those were the kids that I began to follow. And before I knew it, I was going in and out of jail. It started for me with marijuana. Marijuana was the gateway drug. And then the other drugs came. I hung around a group of kids, Glenn, that, going to prison was a rite of passage. If you hadn't been to the penitentiary, you were nobody on our block.
And the strikes that you had, the felonies that got you the 3-strike sentence, were crimes to feed the drug habit? Sure,
they were your commonplace, common ordinary street crimes, assaults, robberies, nothing egregious in nature. Certainly my conduct and my behavior was inappropriate, but I to this day, when I stop and I think about it, there's nothing in my criminal history that is egregious in nature that would warrant a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So how did your life continue unfolding when you got into prison the last time?
Well, I think that what happened was I had some sort of spiritual awakening, I guess you could say, and one day I looked in that stainless steel mirror and said, "This is it." I just really kind of made a conscious decision that if this is where I was going to be, that I was going to try to make the best of that situation. And so I chose to get involved in some positive programs and try to educate myself. And I continued to immerse myself in appellate litigation because I always believed at the end of the day that I was truly the only one that could help myself.
And when you were transferred from a nastier place to the Monroe Reformatory, which is still nasty, and you really got into studying law there. And can you tell us about that?
Well, actually, my legal endeavors actually began when I was in the county jail fighting for my life, and that continued. That process continued throughout my incarceration. But certainly, when I was moved from Clallam Bay to Monroe, Monroe was a much more progressive institution, and there were more. There were opportunities for more education, and of course there was a law library there. But ironically, Glenn, I actually found the error that eventually resulted in my freedom. I found that outside of the law library.
Oh, okay.
Granted, it was years of study that enabled me to understand what I had found. But really what I'm sharing with you today is that the miracle didn't come from the law library itself.
So, and can you summarize what the legal point was that exposed the injustice of your sentence?
Certainly. I discovered what's called a facial invalidity, and in a nutshell, what it means is that this guilty plea that was a contract was, in essence, it was void because it was based on misinformation, and because that misinformation rendered my plea involuntary, unintelligent, and unknowing, it therefore was a due process violation, and it could not stand.
And it was because that one robbery was not completed. Was that a part of it?
No, actually what it was that the statutory maximum sentence that was given to me on that conviction was doubled, and it should not have been doubled.
Okay.
And so, in essence, I was given a term of confinement that was unauthorized by statute.
Okay, great. So what implications arise as a result of your experience and your new insights about looking at the three strikes law in particular, or the criminal justice system overall? What lessons are there to be learned from this?
Well, I think that what we've seen is this fear and this let's just lock everyone up. Let's not focus on how to fix this problem. Let's just send them away. Let's just put a Band-Aid on it. And I think that really the sad irony to it is that we've played God, and we've determined, based on this piece of legislature, how someone is going to rehabilitate, or if that person is capable of rehabilitation. We've basically said, I don't think you can. And that's what I think really is wrong with this mandatory sentencing. I think that's really what's wrong with this particular initiative, because it takes away the hope, it takes away any potential, and it basically says you're not redeemable. And I don't believe in that concept. I think that the opportunity for a person to be rehabilitated and to restore themselves should always be available.
It seems to me that in order for any kind of official system, whether it's a criminal justice system or whatever system, to survive in our society, it needs to have trust and credibility, and people have to believe that it's fair. And this seems, the case that we're talking about, the three strikes law, just seems to fail on that. I
agree, and I think that it's arbitrary and capricious in nature, and it basically says, listen, human beings are not junk. And what the three strikes law says is that these human beings are junk, and we're going to throw them out. We're going to throw them out with the rest of the trash. And I don't prescribe to that. And I think that I am just one example of a guy that was thrown out with the rest of the junk. And what I can tell you is today I pay taxes. I go to work every day. I'm a father, a grandfather, a son, and I do not participate in illegal activities.
And you were in for what, 15 years?
I did 12 years.
12. Yeah, your husband has been.
We're 15. Yeah.
I mean, here's two examples here of people who both really turned their lives around, and society is way better off with you on the outside, and I think our society would be better off with your husband on the outside.
Well, it's really no different than reprimanding children. Sometimes you have to swat them in the butt more than once, and you finally they get it.
But you don't give them a timeout that dehumanizes them for
it's
the rest of their life. That's just extreme.
You have to let them off the stair at some point.
Yeah. Noemi, tell us some more about the origin of the three strikes law. We passed it by initiative in 1993, and it's actually called the Persistent Offenders Accountability Act. What else can you tell us about the passage of that law?
Do you mean the kind of like the historical context of it?
Yeah,
or?
like the context or the meaning or what was going on or whatever.
Well, this was 1993 was a year that is interesting to look at in crime statistics, and this is the year that three strikes was passed. The statistics I've looked at, this was the year that violent crime peaked in Washington State, and nationwide too. And we did have a crime wave in the United States starting around the late 1960s, and violent crime really did increase a lot, and people were mad. So this law arose from that, and also arose from the discovery by political players that crime pays for the politician. I don't know if everybody here remembers the whole Willie Horton thing in the presidential election. What year was that? 1980 something.
Yeah, it would 88. It would be when the older Bush
Dukakis
ran
right
after having served as Reagan's vice president, and he ran in '88 and got elected.
And pinning this charge on Dukakis, the Democratic contender, that he let a bad person get out of prison and hurt other people. A lot of people attribute him losing the presidential election to that. And so we had these two forces with the crime pays for politicians and the high crime rates coming together. And we saw a lot of tough on crime laws. And I think of three strikes as really kind of the heart of that in a way, because the severity and extremeness of it is more than a lot of laws. It basically says, as Vance was saying here before, that we are going to throw human beings away forever. This is a forever law. So that was the historical context.
Now,
and also to kind of mention, there were a number of attempts to pass this law, to get this law on the ballot, that failed. And the National Rifle Association stepped in and was the biggest contributor, tens of thousands of dollars, paid signatures gatherers. And we were told, the voters were told, and I remember this in 1993, that these are going to be the murderers and rapists that we're taking off the street. And it passed by about 70-something%.
Yeah, and we'll in a few minutes we'll talk about what's really happened. But the fact that the National Rifle Association was a big supporter of this makes me a little bit suspicious of their motives. It may be that they wanted to deflect attention away from the role of guns to saying, well, it's those bad guys.
Well, you're not the only one saying that. So, that has been that's been the assessment of a lot of people, and they did have a campaign at that time. The guns kill people, people don't kill
guns
people.
Don't kill people. Yeah. And so that's part of their way of trying to avoid responsibility for their products and pin it on some other people.
Three strikes is the epitome of saying that the responsibility for violence is all on the individual. It's not shared with the individual and society. There aren't systemic problems. It's all the individual human being.
Yeah, and that's a very simplistic kind of notion, and those simplistic notions are typically wrong. So tell us what's happened since then. What are we discovering about what's really been happening? Well,
there's been quite a bit of research on how three strikes works, and the assessment that's very, I won't say it's the consensus, but overwhelmingly research that is not sponsored by special interest groups shows that it has uncertain effectiveness, low effectiveness, unintended consequences, and even the studies that show that there is some mild crime reduction effect, and most studies show there is no crime reduction effect, or that it actually increases crime. Those that show there is some crime reduction effect, the ones that I've seen, say, well, we would get much more crime reduction if we used that money for more effective crime fighting policies.
Yeah.
So that the research says it doesn't work, basically.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of research, including a lot that's been done in this state by a small state agency that does this kind of research, and they look at the cost effectiveness of various kinds of crime fighting methods and what to do with kids, what you can do with kids with early intervention or with counseling or better education or social services or whatever. And they look at what works and what reduces crime and what doesn't. And there are a lot of things that really pay off handsomely in terms of reduced costs for court problems and incarcerating kids and stuff. So we know some things that really do work, and yet this thing, which doesn't work, keeps chewing up tax dollars and wasting lives.
You're talking about Washington State Institute for Public Policy.
Right.
It's a government think tank, basically, nonpartisan. And it hasn't looked at three strikes specifically that I'm aware of, but it's looked at a whole host of rehabilitative kinds of approaches that do work.
I've read a report they have this thick that compares dozens of things related to kids.
It's amazing.
They do really, really good work. It's only a handful of people, but they do great work. And the legislature comes up with these questions and says, look at this for us, will you? And let's find out about that. You mentioned the concept of proportionality, and I wonder if anybody, when we were doing the phone conversations to prepare for it, all of you talked about proportionality. Could somebody tell us some more about this notion of proportionality in relation to the three strikes law?
I was just at a class the other day at the UW with somebody from the Department of Corrections, and their numbers are that African American percentage is lower than white, but the African American percentage in the state is so much lower that it just skyrockets the number right out.
You've got some numbers in your head, is that right?
Well, you're talking about proportionality versus racial disproportionality. So crime fitting the time.
Let's talk about either one. Yeah.
Okay, so going to the race
issue. We want to talk
issue,
about both.
And this is I've verified recently. Washington State Department of Corrections publishes its demographic breakdown of the population of people who are in prison and under community supervision, and that is 19.7%. Basically, 20% of the people in Washington State who are in prison are African American, and our state population is about 3.5% black. Well, the three strikes population is 40% black, and this is not a reflection of who is committing crimes. It's very well established that in all steps of the criminal justice system, that from arrest to conviction to the amount of time you get sentencing, there's a disparity that increases along each step of the way for people who are black. And in Washington State, one of the thoughts is we're one of the worst in the nation, and one of the thoughts is that is perhaps because we have a low percentage, there's less political power for African American people in this state.
Yeah, it seems like there are these filters that occur at each stage, and if you have a society with some systemic bias or institutional racism or systemic kinds of things, those filters will get applied, and that bias just is compounded at every step.
Well, three strikes is like the top of the feeding chain.
And we see this. I do a lot of work to abolish the death penalty, and we run into that sort of thing there when there are so many filters, so many steps. So there are two kinds of proportionality we should talk about. That's the racial one, and then there's the proportionality about does the sentence fit the crime? And that's a basic principle: is the sentence should fit, the punishment should fit the crime. So what can you tell us about that?
You know, there's a reason why our symbol of justice is the Statue of Liberty with the scales, with the blindfold. And there's the reason for that is because justice is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to be, there's supposed to be some equality, right? And you know, here's what I can tell you. Listen, there's only 4 states in the nation that have life without parole for these type of mandatory sentencing schemes. And Washington is one of them. We're also the first. We're the first and the worst. We have the longest list of strikeable offenses. But I think what's really disheartening is that in most other jurisdictions that have a form of mandatory sentencing, robbery too is not a qualifying strike offense, but it is in Washington.
And again, secondary robbery is one where it doesn't require a weapon and it doesn't require that anybody be hurt.
It can be as little as making a verbal threat. You can tell someone, "Give me your money," walk away from that person, and that person can say, "I was in fear," and that you just signed up for an attempted robbery, and that's a strike.
Okay.
It can be that minor. And I think and let me just say this, I think when we talk about this whole issue of proportionality, that's one of the reasons why the Sentencing Guideline Commission did this comprehensive evaluation and study, and they said this crime, second-degree robbery, is not commensurate, and moreover, assault too needs to be reviewed as well because the range of conduct is so broad.
And the Sentencing Guideline Commission is a governmental entity that includes representation from...
It's made up of legislators, judges, prosecutors.
Yeah, so it's not like a left-wing thing that's trying to
these are
work
people,
an angle here.
These are people that know sentencing policies.
And they've been urging dropping that for some years now, right?
Well, they first did that study in 2001, and actually there were two other recommendations that were made. One was to make robberies of all financial institutions a first-degree robbery, and they passed that.
The legislature passed that.
That's right, and they adopted that, and that is now law. If a person robs any financial institution, if he does it with his finger under his coat, it's a first-degree robbery. And the other one was to examine assault too. So
the legislature has not done that,
and they have not removed robbery too.
Right. I mentioned when I was introducing the program about the burden on taxpayers. It's like sentencing taxpayers to a lifetime of paying for people who don't need to be in prison for a lifetime. This seems to be just a terrible waste of tax dollars. And when we have the state with so much budget problem, to be throwing money at this, it's like conservatives complain about big government programs that don't work, and this seems like one of those. This is like big, expensive government thing, and it has no usefulness, and yet the legislature won't let go of it, or at least not yet. We'll see what they do in the new legislative session.
Well, Seattle Times had an editorial last year, I think it was February of 2009, this year, in which they said, "Come on, legislature." I mean, I'm paraphrasing. Come on, legislature. This is common sense. You see this bill every year. It's not necessary for public safety. You're afraid of looking soft on crime. You're being the softies. Just pass the law. Over the reform.
Let's see. Are there some other remedies you're looking for? I know that you probably get accused of being soft on crime, like the legislators are afraid of being. But if somebody says, "Are you soft on crime? Or are you like not wanting people to be accountable?" How do you answer that?
No.
Well,
I tend to be a hard ass, so sorry. I don't know if I can say that. But
you can say that, and you just did. So.
Well, Glenn, I think that if you examine the length of sentences that most of the guys, listen, there are guys such as Maura's husband and some of the other guys that have been in on this law since since 97, 95. I mean, these guys have pulled 10 and 15 years now. And, if you look at the conduct, I hardly call that being soft on crime. I mean, we're talking, decades in prison, right? And the fact of the matter is that we know now there's fact-based evidence that says that the highest majority of persons that are languishing in prisons under these mandatory sentencing laws are not heinous and egregious criminals. They're drug addicts who are committing common, ordinary street crimes, and really what they need is they need some drug treatment, some intervention, some education. And those types of things. And we know that works.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that our society does is we persist in looking at drug use as a criminal issue rather than as a public health issue. And some other countries in Europe that have a more enlightened approach recognize this as a public health issue, and so they want to help people kick their habits. They want to make sure that if somebody is going to be addicted, at least they have safe ways of doing it with needle exchange programs or whatever, and try to do harm reduction, reduce the amount of harm that comes from this, so they can do their thing but not go out and be committing street crime. And we, in this country, by keeping it illegal and punishing people, we perpetuate and accelerate this whole crime thing. And you look at prohibition of alcohol decades ago that allowed for a big increase of organized crime, and that's what you see with the drug thing. It just seems like we have our heads on backwards.
We approach it as a moral issue.
Yeah.
And it may be a moral issue, but to the extent it's moral, that's the person who has to deal with it.
But
The
it's a
governmental
criminal
approach,
issue.
what we do is when we decide to be tough on crime or soft on crime as opposed to being smart on crime,
Yeah.
and in this case with drugs, what we do is we end up with more victims of crime. So the real moral issue here are all of the victims of crime that are being created when we don't take the practical approach of harm reduction.
Yeah.
And the victims include the children of the people who are in
Yeah.
prison,
Yeah.
the family members of the people who are in prison, the people who, have the robbery too happen to them.
Yeah. In the work that you're doing, you're reaching out to the public. We're doing this on the TV program, and all three of you have helped with public outreach through Justice Works, which we'll talk about a bit later in the program. What do you find when you reach out to the public? Does the public get it, or are they clueless, or someplace in between? Or
Most people that I know don't have a clue. They know about 3 strikes, and they know that it was the worst of the worst. They have no idea that you can walk down the street and bump somebody and pickpocket them, and you're done. If that's the way that you choose to support your habit. And you were talking about public health. They talk about addiction as a disease. How could it not be health? But yeah, they're becoming more and more educated, and most of them are just flabbergasted at what really happens.
Yeah, there's that big gap between
Yeah.
what the voters thought they were getting and what
They're
really
like,
happened.
whoa.
What are you folks finding in your public outreach?
Similar, people are shocked and amazed at what the law really has done. And I do need to clarify that prosecutors are less often now prosecuting people for these lower seriousness crimes, just to kind of put that and make sure we get that in the program. The law still needs to be changed.
Yeah.
But people start out, really? I voted for that law. I hear that again and again. I mean, Vance and I, we figured we'd talk to how many people it was 150 or 300 people in one day. I forget what we decided on, but and we heard that. And we've been doing community festivals and just a lot of outreach, and over again, I voted for that law, I supported that law, I can't believe that. And people get it when you explain it and you show them the proof. People need to see the proof because it's so unbelievable.
Yeah, I voted against it, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
I'd like to vote sometime to repeal it if there were ever an initiative to do that. If the legislature won't do it, that's another route. How are you doing public outreach? I know we met. I met the two of you at an event we were doing in Tacoma, working to abolish the death penalty, and you folks were at the same event with your information table working this issue and other issues.
Well, on a personal note, as a person who was, a former persistent offender, it's personal to me. I know many decent human beings that are, again, they're languishing in prison, and so I take advantage of every opportunity I have to use my story to talk about this issue on a public level. And then obviously we've been doing a lot of work with different grassroots organizations, the Justice Works, the Citizens for Responsible Justice. One of the ways that we are trying to bridge with the community so that we can educate is our Gifts for Kids program that we're going to be doing here next month. It provides us an opportunity to give back to these children, these poor children that are left behind. But also, it gives us an opportunity to talk to the parents while the kids are running around having a great time.
This is a program that Vance founded, Gifts for Kids for children of incarcerated parents.
Okay.
Yeah.
how do you see the different elements or interest groups or sectors of the public or other folks wanting to repeal? What kind of folks want to repeal or reform it? We've talked about people who maybe would like to have it entrenched.
Well, my experience is that you're more middle class, maybe upper class, that don't have a lot of contact with the police, and they're just really not aware of how law enforcement works, how crime and punishment works. In my experience, those are the people that seem to think that 3 strikes is okay. It's been my experience, again, that it's the people that are really affected by the law that seem to be the most, I guess they're just a little bit more informed and educated, because let's face it, if you come from a poor social class, you have more dealings with the police.
Yeah. Well, and you know more people who are directly affected.
Certainly.
So.
Yeah, and I'd like to clarify that the liberal versus conservative kind of, I don't know, metaphor or whatever, that this is not actually a liberal or conservative issue. There have been only a few Republican sponsors of bills, but they've been among the most conservative members of the state legislature. There are.
So what's their reasoning? Is this like?
I haven't asked them, because it was actually years ago that there were there have been police officers 3 of them actually, who are legislators who have co-sponsored 3 strikes reform bills. The organizations
like
backing,
to remove robbery too?
To remove robbery too and assault too.
Okay.
Yeah. Amongst the organizations supporting reform, there's a website, fix3strikes.org. Religious faith organizations, civil rights organizations, legal, labor, a very wide spectrum.
And then you mentioned a few minutes back that some prosecutors are trying to avoid doing the kind of charges that would result in strikes, in a 3rd strike.
Right. Well, what prosecutors have said, and this was the testimony given by the representative Washington Association of Prosecuting Attorneys at the last legislative session,
which is not a soft on crime group.
No, they have said that
WAPA.
WAPA.
Yeah.
Their stance on this is, in the early years of the law, they thought they had to prosecute every robbery ask for the 3 strike sentence for every robbery to, every assault to. Only later they found out, they agreed, whatever, that they have discretion. The prosecutors are the only party to a 3 strikes case that have any discretion. They have chosen to use their discretion, not across the board, but pretty consistently. They've chosen to use their discretion since they discovered they have it, to avoid sentencing most cases if you have all 3 robbery twos. However, the law is used as a hammer. So the prosecutors then have the ability to get defendants to plead to almost anything by simply saying, we'll get you under 3 strikes if you don't.
So it's leverage to get a plea bargain,
right,
rather than go to court.
They're doing their job. They've acquitted themselves well, actually, but...
Yeah, but then judges also, because this shifts a lot of discretion to the prosecutors, the law itself takes a lot of discretion away from the judges.
Judges have
who cannot rule on a case-by-case basis. So I can imagine there must be judges that want to get this fixed.
Well, and I'd like to add something, because I actually work for Jeffrey Ellis. I work for Ellis Holmes and Witchley, and Jeffrey Ellis, who's a fine criminal defense attorney, and the bulk of his work is in appellate litigation, and we deal with a lot of these cases. And what I can tell you is that most of the guys that we are defending on persistent offender challenges are those older cases where they were going after everyone. That is not the common practice anymore. It's can we get a plea bargain?
Right. And so for a lot of these older cases, your husband and
We're
others...
number 10.
Pardon me?
We're number 10. We were the 10th one to be struck out.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, here are a lot of people who've turned their lives around, and their continued imprisonment doesn't serve anybody's purpose.
Right. And the reason why a person like Vernell Hennings was probably not afforded an opportunity for a plea is because, again, back then, they weren't offering deals. It was a new toy, and if we can get you, we're going to get you.
You mentioned at the beginning of the show, when we were talking about the context in 1993, You said that 1993 was also when King County began the drug court, which is a way of being smart on crime, not just tough on crime. Tell us something about that.
I find it very interesting. 1993 was also the year my son was born. It's a very important year.
That wasn't a crime.
It wasn't a crime, no. That was a gift. But that year, looking at the statistics, crime being at its peak in Washington State, and nationally too, around that time. And then we passed 3 strikes, first state in the nation. At that year also we had the first drug court in King County, and I think that I was just told that we were like the 18th drug court or the 15th or something, and now there are hundreds or thousands across the country.
There's one in Thurston County. It works very, very well.
And if you go to the King County prosecutor's site, I don't know if the Thurston County prosecutor's site has this, there's some kind of announcement there that says something like, for every graduating class, the county saves $1 million. And that's just the monetary, let alone the cost that you can't quantify of to the victims who are not victims, because right. And so that I find that fascinating, that the 2 approaches we've had to dealing with this wave of crime. And by the way, crime has fallen across the country dramatically since then, and it's fallen faster in states that don't have 3 strikes. Right. But that these 2 approaches both happened in the same year in Washington State. One approach we've had over a decade now to discover works really well in reducing both crime costs and suffering, and that is treating the problem under the cause of the crime. And the other, throwing people away like they're trash, actually doesn't work.
And costs more, and
costs
as you said earlier, there's not good evidence showing that it reduces crime anyway. Let's see. I had another thought. Oh, the whole notion of a life sentence, besides what you've said about throwing people away, has its own problems. I've seen it referred to as death by incarceration. I mean, the idea that you're going to be there for the rest of your life, and although it's not a death sentence in the form of capital punishment, it's a sentence that says you're going to die in prison just eventually. And there's a certain amount of cruelty to it and loss of hope. And from the research that I've read, people who are serving a sentence where there's no hope of ever getting out run a much higher risk of mental illness and all kinds of other problems. And it seems like if a society wants to be humane, we need to rethink that.
Certainly. We know a gentleman named James Moody, who's tried to take his life a few times now because he just can't handle he can't bear the burden.
The United States actually still allows life sentences for people who commit crimes before the age of 18. There are only 2 nations in the world that allow that. One is the United States, the other is Somalia. So, I mean, you see whose level of human rights we're in league with. There's one of the ridiculous aspects of this 3 strikes law is that we've let a simplistic baseball rule be the driving logic of our criminal justice system. And the law used the slogan 3 strikes and you're out, and people thought at some level, oh, well, that makes sense because they're so familiar with how to play baseball. But that doesn't make sense. And if we're going to let baseball rules, I've been proposing that we have a safe at home law. And that says you can commit a crime, but if you get home before the cops do, you're safe. They can't prosecute you. I mean, that would be just as silly. People would say, well, that's silly. That's just a baseball rule. Well, 3 strikes and you're out is a baseball rule. So let's base our sentencing on real evidence and, about what works, what doesn't work. Anyway, I just find that to be bizarre, so I had to put that out.
It's insulting to turn justice into a game.
Yeah. We have just about 10 minutes left. I want to cover a couple more things. One is we've talked about how when you send somebody to prison, you're really sending the whole family there. And for a society, and when we have politicians that talk about family values, I wonder if any of us could talk some more about what the realities are for the families and the struggles of keeping families together and all these kinds of things.
Well, my biggest struggle is the monetary struggle, and it's not me personally, but the things that I see. There's men that are incarcerated with my husband that lose 55% of whatever is sent to them and their wages. So in order for my best friend to send her husband enough money for a typewriter, which cost $200. She had to send in $700. That took $500 out of her 9-year-old's pocket.
And the reason for that
LFOs or
legal
fees,
obligations,
victims' fees, child support, a whole bunch of different things.
So there's things that are taken out by the prison
right.
for certain purposes
yes.
of money that comes in.
They take it out of his wages and
right.
they take it out of my wages again.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest burden that I can see. I pay for everything that happens, you know, his medical and everything. So it's a huge burden. Plus, the state's still paying. So I don't understand it at all. But
I think another important factor that that really needs to be addressed is that this whole ideology that that we're punishing this guy, right? We're just punishing him. But really, if you take a father away for 10, 15 years, when maybe he could have been back home in 3 or 4 or 5, his children are growing up without him, and so where's the role model? Where the cycle continues for a reason, and we know this, right? I mean, we know that the chances for the offspring of a prisoner are higher, that he's going to follow in those footsteps, and there's just such a huge this is a human problem. This isn't even a crime problem. This is a social problem. It really is, and it does. It tears families down. The Department of Corrections is a meat grinder, and it does. It takes the families with us. When I went in, my mother walked into visiting rooms. When I left, she rolled in a wheelchair.
Yeah. Tell us about the process of turning yourself around. You were in, and you've got some insights into how, based on your experience, how maybe other people can turn things around for themselves, apart from the changes in the law that we all are advocating.
Sure. Well, I'll be honest. I think that my situation was exceptional and extraordinary because I had such a huge network of support. But the average prisoner doesn't have that. And I took advantage of 12 years of educating myself, and I spent 12 years with my nose in books, and I took advantage of every single educational opportunity that I could. So I left prison with some computer skills and a little bit of legal knowledge, and and some life skills. I went to prison and I worked on myself, right? But the biggest thing is that I had already made the decision that I was no longer going to participate in criminal activity, and I think that that's something that is paramount, that has to happen, and it has to happen inside. The guy has to say, I'm going to come out and I'm going to be a good guy. Listen, my rent has to be paid. I have to show up at my job every morning. At the end of the day, nobody cares that Vance Bartley went to prison for life and got out. I have to compete just like everyone else, and I don't get a pat. I shouldn't get a pat on the back for doing the right thing. I should do the right thing because that's what everybody else does. But it's a tough transition, and I've had the same set of problems that anyone else has. But today I just know that committing crime is just not an option for me.
Okay, great, thanks. I wonder if we can put in a plug for Justice Works. I know you volunteer a lot, and
we all do.
All of you have done some, but that's where I met both of you first. And I've been in touch with Justice Works for several years, and a number of years now. And they're actually an affiliate of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and so we sure appreciate them. Can you tell us something about what Justice Works does?
Well,
and we're running pretty tight on time.
Okay. Justice Works is a grassroots criminal justice reform organization, and works primarily in reaching out to the public, organizing public support for policy change, and has a lot of other programs. For example, the Gifts for Kids program is something that Vance is working on in conjunction with Justice Works. I don't know if that's enough information.
And I'm happy that they, for some years, they've been doing a welcome home kind of celebration, like once a month for anybody who's gotten out of prison in the previous month. It's like, welcome back to the community. You're a valued human being, and we're glad you're free. And it just seems like that would be a helpful transition. And they've done work inside and outside, and they specifically address the racism, and they do. I mean, I'm just really pleased with their, and they need a lot of volunteers and financial support and everything else.
Yes.
So, and we'll be showing the website and phone number for that. What would you like folks to be doing to help these things? Presumably contacting legislators about removing robbery,
contact
robbery,
us.
And contact Justice Works.
Because I just did that.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't make a big sound.
Okay.
Contact Justice Works. The reason for that is because we coordinate contacting the right legislators who are on the right committees at the right time to ask for this law to be changed in a targeted way, and that's what's going to make the change happen. So you'll be showing the Justice Is No Game .org site where people can actually go online and put your name in, and you can just put your name and email or more information. That's the big thing. The law won't change, and other things that need to change won't happen unless people are reaching legislators.
Right. Yeah, because that's where it goes. And
we really, really need people.
And we hope people will talk with their friends about what they've learned from this program as well. And so we want to put in a plug for Justice Works, and they're at 206-725-9189 and www.justiceworks.info. And then you mentioned www.fix3strikes.org and www.justiceisnogame.org. All three good sources of information and action.
Yeah.
Could we get a brief closing message from each of you?
Educate yourselves, and everybody will figure it out.
Okay.
I just want to encourage people to just to be aware that human lives are worth saving. We shouldn't be throwing people away.
Right.
I guess the main point I'd want to get across is that change is possible and necessary, and that the participation of each person who thinks that they agree with this is a powerful help in helping that change happen. This is not something that's abstract. This is something that the help of individual people will push over the edge, and so that is very much needed.
Right, and the issue affects real life people, certainly you and your family, and you and your family, and
it's of national importance. It's a human rights issue of national importance. It began here in Washington State.
Yeah, so we got to take responsibility as Washington State to take the lead in fixing it, and certainly we have a lot to do in this nation to turn us around because we're so far behind the rest of the world on these things. I want to thank Moira Hennings and Vance Bartley and Noemi Maxwell. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching the program. We're emerging from an era when the public and politicians just gullibly accepted one tough-on-crime proposal after another. Now the state government is starting to distinguish between what actually works and what does not work. The simplistic three strikes law does not work. The three strikes law is too broad. It sweeps up many people whose crimes were not really dangerous to society. Many people have outgrown their criminal pasts, turned their lives around, and yet they linger in prison, costing taxpayers money when these people could be free and contributing to society. The three strikes law actually sentences taxpayers to spend $1 million for each life sentence that imprisons someone who is no longer dangerous. And as these prisoners become elderly and develop more health problems, the cost of their medical care will impose even more burden on taxpayers and our children and our grandchildren. So we need to move toward reform, to remove robbery too, and so forth. Encourage people to connect with Justice Works, that works statewide as an advocacy group, for information about a variety of other issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence. contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093. Visit www.olyfor.org. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs you. Thanks. Seattle-based organization that works to end racism in the criminal justice system. Noemi, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's going to be an interesting hour because there's a lot of information and you have such interesting things to share from your own backgrounds and your insights that you've been developing over the years. Noemi, I wonder if you could just summarize what some of the main parts of the three strikes law, what that's about.
Well, as you said, this was a ballot initiative, and it was presented to the voters in 1993, passed in 1993. The idea behind the law, or at least what was advertised to people, is commit 3 most serious offenses and you are out, basically. Some people call it 3 strikes, you're in. You're, for the rest of your life, you're in prison. It's actually a sentence of 777 years, 77 months, 77 days, no possibility of release. And the crimes that are defined as most serious range from aggravated murder 1, which is the most serious crime in Washington state, at least as defined by the criminal code, down to crimes that are in the lowest quarter of criminal seriousness under state law, of crimes that result in no injuries, crimes that involve no weapons, and the lower seriousness crimes are actually the most common.
Mm-hmm. Vance, I wonder if you could summarize some of the main problems that people have been discovering with this law over the years.
Yeah, certainly. I think that one of the major discrepancies it revolves around the disproportionality, and you know, the Sentencing Guideline Commission has spoken and said that in particular, robbery 2 and some forms of assault 2. Those crimes are not commensurate with other strike status crimes, and actually it was recommended that robbery 2 be removed altogether.
And that's like second-degree robbery is what people are used to that term, but
it's a non-armed, non-injury offense.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Moira, your husband has firsthand experience with this law, and as a result, so do you. Can you tell us something about your husband's experience and what got him into the situation he's in, and what's happening with him now?
Well, he was a drug addict as a teenager and was never able to come out of it. He was sentenced to prison when he was 19 for a robbery 1. He came out still a drug addict and committed another robbery 1, both of which he pled guilty to. His third strike was a robbery 2, which was actually a drug deal, but it came out as a robbery 2, and not knowing that he was going to get 3 strikes, he asked for a trial, and they decided that it was a strike.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And he wasn't hurting anybody on that.
He's never hurt anyone.
Yeah. So, but it was, and so he was robbing to serve the habit.
Support his crime. Yeah.
Yeah, the habit.
Yeah.
And he's been in for 15 years?
This time 15 years,
yeah.
Yes.
How have you and your husband kept the family together? What's Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. During the past few decades, the public and politicians were adopting one tough-on-crime proposal after another. In 1993, Washington State's voters passed an initiative that made Washington the first state to enact a 3 strikes and you're out law. 3 qualifying felony convictions would result in a lifetime in prison. More than 20 other states have copied Washington. The foolishness of this law is now becoming apparent. Many people have outgrown their criminal pasts, turned their lives around, and yet linger in prison, costing the taxpayers money when these people could be free and contributing to society. The 3 strikes law actually sentences taxpayers to a lifetime of wasting money imprisoning people who are no longer a threat to society. Also, as these prisoners age, they will develop more health problems, and their medical costs will impose additional burdens on taxpayers. Although the initiative supporters claimed that it would protect us from the worst of the worst, actually the 3 strikes law is too broad, and it sweeps up many people whose crimes were not really very dangerous to society. And now a variety of organizations and individuals are working to reform or abolish the 3 strikes law. This month's TV program will focus on this topic. We have 3 guests who will share their knowledge and their insights with us, and I'm happy to welcome Moira Hennings, Vance Bartley, Noemi Maxwell. Moira Hennings' husband is in prison serving a 3 strikes life sentence. She also volunteers for the Department of Corrections Family Advisory Council. Good to have you here, Moira.
Thank you.
Vance Bartley was sentenced to life in prison for 3 strike offenses, but in prison he studied law and discovered a serious defect in the sentencing of his case and the conviction, and after 12 years in prison got his sentence overturned. Vance's knowledge of the law earned him a job as a paralegal in a Seattle law firm. Good to have you here, Vance.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be here.
Thanks. And Noemi Maxwell is a hardworking volunteer on 3 strikes and other criminal justice issues. She volunteers with Justice Works, a